Okay, so last time I introduced you to or elaborated on something that you read about for Kant's deontology or duty ethics. And the word that I focused on the most, just like in the reading, the word that your author focuses on the most, and that is the concept at the beginning of your reading, is what? It starts with an R, reason. Okay. So really reason, that is that humans have something called reason. They have what's called rational nature that can provide rational insights. This really is an important foundational aspect of Kant's theory. And of course, this is very different from Bentham and Mill, who use empirical human observation to notice that human behavior seems to them to be governed only by pain and pleasure. And of course, this is very different with Kant saying reason, okay, should be the focus in terms of deciding what a moral law is, not our empirical observations about human behavior in terms of pain and pleasure. Rather, we have to look inward via reason, and reason is something that is unique to human beings. Okay, so just as a reminder, reason discovers the moral law. Do you remember the weird Latin term that I gave you for the kind of reasoning or justification that Kant says we can use reason? Do you remember the kind of justification that reason uses, according to Kant, to find the objective moral law, to discover objective rightness and wrongness? It was that two-part Latin term, which is discovers the moral law by a priori means. Okay, so you'll remember from last time, a priori justification is how you decide a belief or a claim is true using only your mind's ability to think through the meaning of a word, that is through a concept, its structure, and how it hangs together with other words or concepts. This is the way that he says we must look for the objective moral law. So in doing this, the various concepts that he explores and that were introduced to you briefly in the reading include things like the will versus the goodwill, right? So the will is basically the human capacity or power to choose. If I don't write something down, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't write something down. So like right now, I just said how he uses the word will. So if I'm defining stuff along the way, you should add the definitions, maybe off to the side, and maybe add any additional lecture points that I make off to here. So you could put like the definition right there, you put the definition there, and any additional lecture points that might help you with a future writing task. So the will is simply the power of rational agents to choose. What separates the mere will from what he calls the good will, which you read as the only thing that is unconditionally good according to Kant, is that the good will always conforms to the dictates of reason. In other words, reason controls the will. The reason is in control of the will, and when your will acts on that, then you have what's called a good will. So another couple of important concepts, of course, have to do with motivation and duty. Okay, so remember he talks about, so we could talk about, he has this concept of motivation, and he has this concept of duty. So as you know, he says, when the will is motivated to act from duty, then we say that the will is a good will. Sometimes we can choose actions that are aligned with duty, but if our motivation isn't simply to obey our duty, to obey what reason tells us are our duty, then we're not morally praiseworthy. It is not a good will. So we'll probably get more into that. We might get more into that later, but for right now, just know that. So for him, how you're motivated is really important to deciding whether your will is a good will. And your motivation for him must come from your concept of duty, the idea that you simply must do your duty because it's doing the right thing. You're not thinking about practical, empirical consequences like your situation, emotions, feelings, pain, or pleasure. And then again, well, how do we decide what our duties are? Well, we use reason. So I'm trying to show you how all of these, briefly, how all of these concepts connect for Kant. And again, the idea here is that he is exploring with his own mind the meaning of these words and how these various concepts hang together. Some other things that come into play, some other things that are important to note is what he's talking about when he talks about subjective conditions and what he calls objective conditions. Okay, so remember, reason is able to discover and focus on the objective conditions that are right or wrong. And these objective conditions will tell us what our duties are. And then if we're motivated to act solely from duty because doing the right thing simply is right in and of itself, then when our will chooses to do so, then it's actually a good will. We do not, according to Kant, use subjective conditions because that depends on our personal situation, our feelings, our emotions, or whatnot. And of course, those can change and vary. And so we cannot base an objective moral law or set of duties based on subjective conditions. And so he's thinking through all of these concepts in much the same way that I'm talking you through them. Of course, this is linked to his concept of a hypothetical, imperative, and the notion of a categorical imperative. So remember that an imperative is a command, right? And categorical imperatives pay attention only to objective conditions. Objective conditions are discovered through reason, reason thereby generating duties. When we act from duty, we do the action simply because it is the right thing to do, because that's what reason tells us, then we have a good will. So I'm trying to show you how all of these things connect. There are some other concepts that come into play, but these are some of the most fundamental and powerful concepts that influence his derivation of what he calls the supreme moral principle. So I'm going to start off a sentence here for you for a lecture point that I want you to complete based on what you hear. And so it is, in virtue of using a priori thinking, okay, that is examining with just his mind the meaning of these concepts and how they connect that. So it is in virtue of using a priori thinking. So remember that's a term that is just examining, that is examining with just his mind the meaning of these concepts and how they connect that. Okay, so the missing part is Kant claims to establish his supreme moral principle. Okay, so now we're going to look at some original text. This is an excerpt from the Foundation of the Metaphysics of Morals. So he does all this thinking. He thinks through all these concepts. He thinks about, duty and motivation and reason and rational nature. And based on all that a priori thinking about the concepts, he draws a conclusion. And the conclusion is where I pick up in this excerpt. So you'll see that he says, there is therefore only one categorical imperative. It is, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So this should sound familiar from your reading. How do we know that this is a conclusion that he derives based on the concepts that he analyzes through a priori reasoning? Well, of course, we see the word therefore. So a lecture point that I would like for you to write out here, and remember you can stop and rewind the videos if you need to, is I want you to write here that, or actually you might put it over here, right? So up here you might want to write the following. The conclusion indicator, therefore, shows us that Kant believes he has sufficiently established what he thinks is the objective moral principle that applies to all rational beings. So if you didn't catch that, just rewind the video and write that down as a lecture note. Another lecture note that you might want to write to here is that, like Bentham, Kant's general moral principle doesn't come from nowhere, right? He doesn't just say, here's a principle with no thought to it. So a lecture point you might want to add to that then is that what Kant does, like Bentham, is he argues for it, but from a different starting point. So Bentham argues from the starting point of pain and pleasure based on his human observation. Kant argues for his moral principle in an a priori analytic fashion using only his mind based on the fact that we have this ability to reason. It's from that he figures everything out, or at least he thinks he has. Now, another lecture note that you're going to write is that A through D, that states what he calls his supreme moral principle. It's very important for you to realize that. This is what we would categorize as a general moral principle. So this is a moral statement, but remember, moral statements are two kinds. So this is a moral statement because he is telling us with this should that we are morally obligated to do this. He is saying it would be wrong if we didn't act in this way. So we're morally obligated to act in this way, to make our decisions based on this way. So by saying should, he's saying we're morally obligated to act in a certain way. He is assigning a moral value to something. That's what makes it a moral statement. But it's a special kind of moral statement. It's a general moral principle because he's giving us a rule that can be applied to a variety of instances, categories of action. So make sure you took really good notes because some of you are still struggling with the difference between a moral statement and how a general moral principle is a moral statement, but a special kind. Okay, so like I said, this word should, and you should have this in your lecture notes somewhere, this word should is being used as a moral value. It's a moral term. Now, remember that Bentham's moral principle said that you should always choose the action that's going to result in the best balance of happiness over unhappiness for all involved. That's very different from this one. As you can see, this statement, this general moral principle doesn't talk about happiness or unhappiness or empirical consequences in terms of our situations, feelings, advantages, disadvantages, or anything like that. So moving along, he says then, all imperatives of duty can be derived from this one imperative as a principle. So notice the words imperatives and duties, so that we know that imperatives are commands and duties are right things that we do because they are right. They're simply right to do. And he says that they can all be derived from this one imperative. So another lecture note that you should add over here is, and probably to right here, maybe you could do an arrow or something like that, but something that you want to add as a lecture note to right here is that what he's telling us in lines E through F is that what he's telling us in lines E through F is that this general moral principle can be used as a formula to generate our moral duties. And we will use only reason in doing so. That's an important point. So E through F, he's telling us that in E through F that what's stated in B through D, that is his supreme moral principle, his core categorical imperative, can be used to generate other categorical imperatives that he calls duties. So you have the main categorical imperative that itself is a kind of formula for generating other categorical imperatives that would get classified as duties. Okay, so the mind's ability to reason by using this general moral principle can generate the duties that we need to be aware of. So what I'd like to do now is let's go ahead. We're not going to worry about this because here he's just giving us we're not going to worry about that. That's just another formulation of what he thinks is basically the same core moral principle, the same core categorical imperative. What I want to do now is highlight words that indicate fundamental and powerful concepts. So, of course, categorical imperative, obviously, core concept there. Maxim, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Will, obviously a very important word. Should, core moral word. Become a universal law, those are key concepts. And then in E3F, we would, of course, highlight imperatives and duty, right? Notice that he says derived. And then what is two other words that we might note as key concepts? Imperative and as a principle. And by principle, he really means moral principle. And by this part right here, he's referring back to over there. All right, so let's just go over a couple of terms real quick that are stated in his supreme moral principle, his core categorical imperative. What does he mean by the term maxim? That was in the reading. I want to give you an example that will help you to understand this maybe a little bit better. But a maxim is a subjective rule. So subjective means the person who would be following the rule on which a particular individually actually acts. So there's no moral consideration. So let's say you're in one of Dr. C's face-to-face classes, and we use collaborative learning to get learning done, but also to get assignments done. Let's also say that, let's say that's me. Let's say Susan, okay, when I was a student. Susan the student, before she was a professor. And let's say that I am very introverted, and I don't like to share my ideas in class. I'm not a team worker. I'm intellectually shy. I'm socially awkward, and I really don't like to do collaborative work. I like to sit back maybe and listen to what other people have to say, and I like to be able to do stuff on my own. So now, Kant would say, being a Kantian, I might ask myself, well, despite my psychological reality, my personality, despite my own feelings and levels of comfort, I am a Kantian, and so I need to remember what the categorical imperative says. It says, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So in this case, I need to say, okay, well, what maxim would I be using if I were to refrain from collaborating with my peers, if I refuse to talk and work collaboratively with others, to interact with them and help them work through an assignment or learning task? The maxim that I would be formulating in that case, the subjective rule on which I would be acting if I were to follow through on that, would be whenever I'm in a class that uses collaboration to learn, I will refrain from contributing to absorb the learning by listening only. So let's say that you're supposed to be learning in a group-based setting, but I've decided that whenever that's the case, I'm just going to listen. I'm not going to cooperate. So this is the maxim. It's a subjective rule that I would be generating in my acting in this way. Now, the question is, can this maxim be thought of or converted into a duty? So a duty, remember, is an objective principle upon which everyone should act. So this part has a moral component. Here you might want to add the lecture point that you're just stating the conditions within which a particular action is taken. Okay, so that's what I just gave you a lecture point for. A maxim simply states the conditions within which a particular action is taken. It's the non-moral element of it's just the action, a state of affairs. It's non-moral. But the question is, could this be converted into a moral rule or moral principle, a duty that everyone should follow, have their will conform to? And so, again, this is objective, and it has a moral element. We're trying to decide whether my action, the maxim of my action, can be converted into an objective, imperative, rule, duty that everyone should follow. So then, to formulate that, to figure that out, then I have to realize that the rule, the moral rule that I would be, in theory, generating from this would be, one is obligated, in other words, morally required to refrain from contributing to a class that uses collaboration to learn, using only listening to learn. So the idea with obligated is that it's morally required. It would be wrong if you didn't do it. So the general idea, just to give you the gist, we're going to work through a full written example in a minute, is that, I'm in a class, I'm socially awkward, maybe I'm lazy, maybe I don't have good communication skills, maybe I'm intellectually shy, and so I'm thinking I'm not going to contribute it, I'm just going to listen. So then I have to say, well, what is the maxim? What is the rule that I would be generating if I, as an individual, actually go through with this? Well, here it is. So this is the subjective rule that is particular to me if I take this action. Now, and you saw this in the book and in your week 11 assignment that you did, or your week 12 where you had to go through the reading. So that's the maxim. Step one, I generate the maxim of my action that I have not yet taken, but I'm thinking about it. And then I ask step two, I try to universalize it. So that's what's going on here. You want to write that lecture point. This is step one, the maxim, to see what is the subjective rule that I as a particular individual will be generating. Step two is to see whether it can be a duty, something that is a must, a moral must for all of us. So when we're doing this, we're doing what's called universalization. And you read that in the reading. So step two is, can I universalize this maxim? And so this is the supposed moral principle that I would be generating if I were to act according to this maxim. So then the next step is to ask yourself, can I will, through my maxim, that everybody follow this as a duty, as a moral rule? And so just very quickly to end this part of the lecture, we got to think about this kind of like Kant. We're using only our minds to think through, imagine what might happen. So imagine you're in a class where you decide that you're going to listen only, even though the class functions largely and often, and let's say it's a class that uses only collaboration. Let's say it's a class with no lecture points. Everything is group-based learning all of the time. Well, if everyone adopts this, if you universalize this such that all of your peers in that class follow this as a moral rule, because it would be wrong to do otherwise, they're morally obligated to listen only in a class that uses collaboration to learn, what would happen? According to Kant, what would happen is that you would make learning impossible. And to do this would be irrational, because you're basically saying, I'm going to learn just by listening, but because you're in a class that uses only collaboration to learn, you're undermining what you're trying to do, and you're at the same time willing that you won't learn because no one will talk if you universalize it. So you end up saying, I will learn only by listening, and I will not learn only by listening. That is irrational, right? You're basically canceling out what you're trying to achieve. You're making this impossible. And he would say that this is impossible as not only, I think, a law of nature, because it'd be practically impossible, you're not going to be able to learn, but also conceptually, because in this class, learning is collaborative, but there is no learning if there's no collaboration. Okay, so that's a sense of how Kant works. And so then the decision or the moral conclusion for him would be that this is not a duty that should be, this maxim cannot be universalized as a duty like this. It's irrational, it leads to a contradiction, it's self-defeating, the principle destroys itself. Therefore, the conclusion would be, it would be wrong for you, then this tells us what? Since that cannot be generated as a duty, it would be wrong to act on this maxim. Therefore, actually what this tells us, because it would be wrong for us to do this, it actually tells us what is the right thing. So the duty that would be generated through the thought experiment that I just ran you through is that we are obligated not to refrain, but to fully participate, to fully contribute to a class that uses collaboration to learn, using only listening to learn. That one is obligated to contribute to class that uses collaboration to learn. So in virtue of figuring out that this maxim cannot be universalized, we figure out what is morally required of us. And the categorical imperative in the form of a duty that we get from applying this, in virtue of doing this, is that, again, we are morally obligated to contribute to a class that uses collaborative learning. Okay, so that's just the gist of it verbally. What I'm going to do now is we're going to work through Kant's own example, and I'm going to show you how to analyze the passage, and then I'm going to give you some questions to answer for your writing assignment this week.